So there you have it, preliminary remarks before the two leaders met. Interestingly, if you look at the Trump-Modi conversation, lots of shaking of hands, embracing each other, whether this is COVID times, but you can see a much greater distance between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden. Maybe it's the sign of the times, maybe it's their first meeting, as I said, and therefore it might take a little bit of time to break the ice, or just the way Joe Biden is, in contrast to Donald Trump, who was this larger-than-life leader who liked to use his body language to make a point. But clearly, both leaders expressing pleasantries and reflecting the shared values and concerns, whether it's trade, whether it's climate change, whether it's in COVID times coming together, references to Mahatma Gandhi and democracy as well. I stopped you, Venu Rajamani, just before we heard those two statements. Your sense from the pleasantries, this is much of it really restating first principles, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. And it also restates what I was trying to say earlier, that there is much more to the relationship. To limit it to the China factor would be to do injustice to the India-US relationship. It is built on much stronger and much wider foundations. If you see these remarks, it started with a reference to family ties between Indians and Americans. It talked about the 4 million Americans, 4 million Indian Americans today in the US. There was a reference to Mahatma Gandhi by both President Biden as well as Prime Minister Modi. There was talk about technology. There was talk about democracy. President Biden talked about not just what we do together, but who we are, what we stand for, which is a reaffirmation of the fact that it is values which unite our two countries together. And then there was talk about trade. There was talk about technology. There was no mention of defense, but clearly we all know that it's an extremely important component of our bilateral relationship, and COVID, climate change, all these issues.
You said much more the conversation centered around areas of commonality, areas which will work at multiple levels. Professor Irfan Nuruddin there in Washington, your sense, is this a meeting which is perhaps being shadowed by what comes after this, the Quad? If I look at the New York Times headlines, they're all about Quad. I mean, on the front page, it's not about India as much as it's about Quad. Is Quad going to overshadow this one-on-one? Is the one-on-one a side show this time?
Absolutely, but not in a bad way. I mean, the Quad is the reason for the meeting. And it's such an important meeting because it allows for India to be part of a conversation that, as Professor Mathu pointed out, definitive of at least the next 50 years and maybe longer. We're watching in real time the creation of a new global order, the reinvention of a Cold War. We had thought, some of us, maybe that the Cold War days were over. But, there's a lot of people in Washington who I think missed the Cold War, and now this is their chance to recreate it, with China playing the role that once was occupied by the Soviet Union. That gives India a relevance in Washington that it should use to its advantage, while making sure that India's strategic interests are first and foremost. At the end of the day, in that Cold War that was the post-Second World War era, America and the Soviet Union aligned a lot of satellite countries to do their bidding. There were a lot of proxy wars fought. India is too large a country, too important a country to allow itself to be a satellite of the United States. And I think the real question from these Quad conversations is whether India sees a strategic interest in participating in the Quad that is its interest and not America's interest. The External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, talks about multi-alignment, with echoes, of course, of the classic non-alignment doctrine, rebranded for the current age, of course. But multi-alignment means that India sees its interests as being broader than just the United States. It sees its interests, including with traditional partners like Russia. How does that interact with the Quad? So all of which is to say, the Quad is the reason for this meeting. It's an incredible opportunity for India to be at a particular conversation that is going to be quite influential going forward. But India has to be really careful to make sure that all the bonhomie, all the kind words said about shared values and other aspirational goals don't come in the way of a very close, cold reading of what its strategic interests are, and making sure that whatever happens, whatever agreements are reached, are in India's best interest going forward, not America's.
Let me bring in at that point Michael Kugelman into it. Michael, do you also see Quad overshadowing what we are seeing at the moment between the two leaders? Can we separate the two? Will Quad focus on strategic issues on China, on Indo-Pacific, while here, as you saw in those introductory remarks, a lot of talk on climate change, on trade, on just the sheer shared values that the two countries claim they will take this relationship forward? Do you believe, therefore, that this relationship will be completely independent of what happens at the Quad, where China could well be the focus?
No, the U.S.-India relationship can function on its own, separate from the Quad, though certainly the Quad boosts the U.S.-India relationship. But as you know, the U.S.-India relationship is very safe and very stable for both sides. It enjoys bipartisan support in both countries. It can withstand the invariable tensions that come up just because there are such clearly convergent interests on both sides. And there have been a number of major shocks to the world order since Prime Minister Modi had his last meeting with the U.S. president, which was President Trump. We have this pandemic. We have the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan. We had the Ladakh clash last summer between Indian and Chinese forces. But all of that has kept the U.S.-India relationship in a very strong place. And in fact, in the case of the pandemic and in India's growing tensions with China, that has brought even more benefits to the U.S.-India relationship. It's accentuated pathways for cooperation. But certainly the Quad is very important just because, it's the first in-person leaders meeting. The Quad has been revitalized. The U.S.-India relationship has been going strong for nearly 2 decades. So the fact that the Quad has really come back from the dead, so to speak, it had become irrelevant for nearly 2 decades after some initial successes in 2004 and 2005. The fact that it is back and India is sitting at the same table with 3 key Pacific powers, that's really important, and that's very consequential. And I think that we're at a point now where we could assume that the momentum that the Quad has been enjoying will be sustained just because all 4 Quad countries have seen their relations with China sink to levels not seen in quite some time. And for all we talk about the partnerships on issues like climate change and technology within the Quad, the China factor looms large in a big way in the Quad, and that is a big reason why the Quad has been able to be revitalized over the last few years.
But there are concerns. Both leaders did allude to trade. There are concerns, Meera Shankar, on the India side, that the Americans haven't given us enough, and the Americans feel that the Indians demand too much. Are those areas of divergence on issues like trade going to continue to, in a way, haunt the relationship, that for all this talk of bonhomie and shared values, when it comes to nitty-gritties, there are still several areas of concern and divergence?
I think, divergence on trade issues occurs also between the closest partners, between the US and EU, US and UK, US and Canada. It's in the nature of the beast. But if you take a look at the reality, then the fact is that our trade with the US has been growing. Of course, it was affected by COVID. And they are our largest single trading partner if you take both trade in goods and services. More to the point, they are our largest single export market, and we don't export to many countries. Unlike China, where we have a great trade deficit, we have a small trade surplus with the US, not too much, and trade continues to grow. I think the other thing that Indians need to remember is that the high-tech economy in India, which really propelled the growth of the Indian economy after 1991, took off primarily because of linkage to the US market. At that time, the backward penetration of IT in India was very, very limited. The domestic market was non-existent. And even today, almost 60 to 70% of our IT service exports go to the US market. So there's an intrinsic linkage there. And I think that's something which really the Quad is going to build on, because, if you look at the 3 working groups which were set up in the last meeting of the Quad, One was on the pandemic and production of vaccines and how these countries could cooperate. So India was to manufacture American vaccines, so American technical know-how, Indian manufacturing, Australian logistics, and Japanese finance. I think this was the kind of deal that they had put together. But of course, it was derailed at the time because of our own second wave and our inability to export. But perhaps now we can, begin to think of this. And so this will be discussed. What are the deliverables to supply vaccines to the Asia Pacific? The second working group was on on climate change, and that's a key area of concern because you have the Conference of Parties coming up to discuss the Paris Agreement, and you have the Biden administration in the US, which has restored climate change to the center of the US global agenda, but also their domestic agenda. And they are thinking of reviving their economy actually by boosting the whole green and new and emerging technologies economy.
It's interesting you're drawing. It's interesting you're drawing the contrast in particular when you look at issues like climate change, which was certainly not top of President Trump's agenda. We played those images of the Trump-Biden, of the Modi-Biden meeting and contrasted it with Mr. Modi's meeting with President Obama and then with President Trump. Venu Rajamani, you've served as a press secretary to the Indian president. Do we look too much into body language? When I look at the images of Mr. Modi with Mr. Trump, they seem to be much more effusive with each other. Here, there seems to be an element of distance. Am I reading too much into it?
At first sight, yes, there seems to be an element of distance, and that probably reflects the two different personalities that President Biden and President Trump are. But if you see the visuals of President Biden greeting Prime Minister Modi inside the room, you see a lot more warmth. So perhaps it was the setting outside which gave that impression. Inside the room, when the two of them are alone with just their interpreters, you can clearly see much better language, much better body language, much greater warmth.
That's what we saw. Professor Mattu, in the past, democratic administrations have been tough on India, particularly on issues like Kashmir, human rights, and the relations have often not quite worked out. Do you believe, though, that 2021 is very different, particularly in the backdrop of all that's happening in and around the region? Therefore, unlike the past where democratic administrations were tough on Kashmir, tough on human rights, we even heard yesterday Kamala Harris speak about need to strengthen democratic institutions. How do you interpret that? Are we more comfortable with this democratic administration or not?
Look, Rajdeep, as I pointed out and what Professor Irfan Nuruddin expressed brilliantly, look, there's often a value in parsimony, which means not reducing the world to a single binary, but at least getting a clear bird's eye view. There's a new Cold War happening. That's the principal contradiction in the international system today, the rise of China. Now, India has to decide what space, what autonomy it requires to play into America's grand designs to contain China. Whether it's part of Quad or whether it's part of some other arrangement, that is something for India to figure out, what its foreign policy. Now, quite apart from that, yes, democratic administrations have been more assertive in terms of human rights, non-proliferation, other civil rights issues. But when there is this overwhelming shadow of a Cold War, all these differences become marginal. When hegemonic superpowers deal with global issues, these issues are important, but these issues are not going to over-determine the relationship. Remember, this is a government which has just walked out of Afghanistan and left Afghanistan to the mercy of the Taliban, which hardly has a human rights record to speak for. So let's not talk about human rights and non-proliferation issues. Human rights is an issue that we need to address for ourselves. But in the larger scheme of things, I don't think India, US nations are at a point when issues like human rights or Kashmir, anything will be derailed because, or those issues will derail the bilateral relationship. They are far more important. They are larger strategic strategic issues at play at the moment, and that's what we need to focus on. I think the one great point that was made during the press conference, personally from you, was, for instance, talking about Gandhi's whole idea of trusteeship. I mean, I genuinely believe in that principle, that this is a planet that you have inherited in a way to pass on to the new generation with a certain sense of responsibility. And that sense of responsibility is both individual, societal, national, and international. As much rests on you as it rests on me, how we use our air conditioners at home, or how the international system functions in a way to ensure that we are more responsible in ensuring that our future generations will inherit a sustainable planet. So those important things are important, but fact is that China is the biggest issue at the moment, the rise of China.
Irfan Nuruddin, should we therefore set aside, what Vice President Kamala Harris said yesterday when she spoke of the need to strengthen democratic institutions? I'm just going to play that soundbite of Kamala Harris, and I want you to respond to that. Should we just set all that aside and just focus on the big picture, which is strengthening the relationship? Listen in for a moment to what Kamala Harris had said yesterday.
Finally, as democracies around the world are under threat, it is imperative that we defend democratic principles and institutions within our respective countries and around the world, and that we maintain what we must do to strengthen democracies at home. And it is incumbent on our nations to, of course, protect democracies in the best interest of the people of our countries.
Irfan Nuruddin, should we sort of keep aside the Democrats usually lecturing India on democratic values and focus instead on what is the challenge, as was said by Professor Mattu, the rise of China, the need to build stronger relationships strategically, as well as the other enormous areas of commonality on issues like climate change, on technology, on trade?
Yeah, so I think Vice President Harris was, very carefully crafted comment that would clearly satisfy those who want to make sure that America is pushing what they see as democratic backsliding in India. But she framed it very carefully. She talked about it in both countries. I don't think that was a lecture, though it might be seen as such by those of us who are hypersensitive about anything that might seem as a criticism of India. I actually think that this democracy angle is an important one for both India and the United States to take seriously, because that becomes the primary calling card and justification, legitimation, if you would, of the Quad framework. This, if it is supposed to be something more than just simply anti-China, if this talk about shared values, oldest and largest democracy, is to have any legitimacy whatsoever, it starts with both countries recognizing that democracy is under challenge around the world. And as the ostensible leaders of democracy around the world, again, oldest and largest, then it behooves them to take democracy seriously at home as well. So I don't see that as a problem. But as Professor Mattu pointed out, I mean, look, the US does work with Saudi Arabia, with Egypt, with a whole lot of countries that it sees as strategic partners that have not even a patch of claim on human rights and democracy. So big picture strategic interests are the name of the game today, and India is ready to play that game and should play that game.
Michael Kugelman, do you agree that the rise of China, in a sense, is now going to be the critical issue which will inevitably bring the two countries, India and America, closer together in the years ahead?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. And it's been that way for a few years. Since this era of wolf warrior diplomacy began in Beijing, where it began to pursue its interests more aggressively around the world, I think that's made it very clear to India and the US how important it is for both of them to work together to push back against this China threat. But I think the key phrase now is next steps, right? There's been so much done with the US-India relationship in recent years. The security relationship has grown. But I think the point now is how to build on all of that momentum. And specifically, there have been a number of military agreements signed over the last few years, foundational agreements that will allow the militaries to work better together, how to implement those agreements, how to move forward with them in ways that can help the relationship move forward. I think that's going to be a big question, and something that I know US officials are very keen to discuss with their Indian interlocutors. I think that's a considerable issue, particularly important issue in the context of India's concerns about terrorism emanating from Afghanistan after the US withdrawal? How can the US put India in a better position to address those concerns of terrorism? Could that entail more technology and other type of defense equipment that's been made available to India after the US and India signed those Kamkasa and Becca agreements, that type of thing? So I think that's the key now moving forward for the US-India relationship. Yes, it's all about China, but how can the two sides work on these various agreements and partnerships that have come about in recent years to have more evidence on the ground that they are in a position to push back against these threats posed by China, posed by terrorism, and the like?
Shankar, do you therefore believe that the future is in a way, as I keep reiterating, that the theatre is now shifting for this relationship from South Asia? For years, we would be concerned about how the US was looking at Pakistan, how were they looking at the region. Now it's about how we look at China together and focus on the Indo-Pacific. That the theatre of this, the strategic locus of this relationship has shifted to the Indo-Pacific.
To some extent, I would say the US is focused clearly on the Indo-Pacific, but after withdrawing from Afghanistan. But as far as India is concerned, yes, China is the primary challenge, but there's also a South Asian dimension of the China challenge on our borders, which is of primary concern to us. So
I'm sorry to intervene. Are the Americans concerned enough? You know, we've heard that there are statements where they've sort of expressed their concerns over Pakistan and terror, but you know, will America really walk the talk on that?
Well, I think to expect that America would, really fight for India, I think is not realistic, and nor do we have such an alliance, and nor are we seeking it. But I think clearly where America can make a difference is in terms of real-time intelligence sharing on troop deployments, etc., along the border. It can also make a difference in terms of building our capacities for better, creating a secure grid of surveillance which can prevent infiltration or preempt. So I think these are the kind of areas where the US would be a very important partner for India, because India is looking to build its capacities and capabilities, and the US is our largest source of technology collaboration. We buy quite a bit of defense equipment from the US, and as Michael said, we've put in place all the foundational agreements. The technology cooperation in the defense sector is still not very robust. We have the Defense Technology and Trade Initiative and some pilot projects, but how do we really give that momentum? I think is one of the things that the two countries will have to discuss. And as far as India is concerned, we'll keep an eye both ways. We'll have to be Janus-faced, because one side of India, the east of India, looks eastward towards China, and the west of India looks westward. So I think we have to be Janus-faced.
You know, it's interesting you're using that, because Amitabh Mattu only last week, AUKUS, Australia, USA and UK signed the new defense deal, controversial, America and Britain helping Australia deploy nuclear-powered submarines in the Pacific region, and this has led to some controversy, particularly with the French. The sense you get that eventually the Americans will also have their own other alliances and relationships independent of what they do with India.
Oh, absolutely. I think a hegemonic superpower, even if it's on decline, will enter into alliances at multiple levels and will make choices that seem difficult. I mean, for instance, the exit from Afghanistan worked to our disadvantage, because it seemed to advantage Pakistan and the ISI, given that the Taliban are going to return to power. Similarly, the French, who have been always neo-Gaullist in their foreign policy, are really absolutely amazed at the manner in which, amazed in a very negative sense, in which the Americans and Australians arrived at a deal.
No, but the Americans seem to be only looking at their own national interest. I mean, the Biden administration decides to withdraw from Afghanistan, leaves Afghanistan to a possibly ISI-backed regime. Where does this leave all this so-called bonhomie with India?
Rajdeep, hegemonic stability is a concept in international relations which says that if you have a powerful superpower which imposes certain rules of the game, then there will at least be some degree of stability in terms of issues of war and peace. That's the minimum guarantee that America gives to its allies. Look, you're not going to collapse. You're not going to be faced with a war that you will be defeated in. That's the only guarantee that you have from a hegemonic superpower.
Okay.
Everything else is up for grabs. So what you need to do as an aspiring regional power or a great power like India is to navigate through this system to try and find as much space as possible. As much space to have your strategic autonomy while not challenging your hegemonic ally, while also ensuring that the challenge from the East, which is China, is met. It's a difficult game, but this is like a grandmaster playing chess. You have to think in advance, strategize, and unfortunately, we do not have, with due deference to all diplomats, in the capacity within the Foreign Service. How many thousand people here?
Let Venu Rajamani get a final word on that. Venu Rajamani, here is Professor Mattu saying we need more chess grandmasters in the Foreign Service who are going to sort of keep all the pieces in place and think one step ahead of their rivals.
Well, I think we have exceptional talent in the Foreign Service. And considering the difficult circumstances under which we meet and the sheer lack of numbers, our Foreign Service is small. But considering the small numbers and the difficult circumstances that surround India, the rapidly changing international environment, we have done a wonderful job. I think there is a great leader in Prime Minister Modi right now when it comes to foreign policy. So is their External Affairs Minister, Jaishankar. We have the talent. We can deal with the situation. Amitabh Mattu said well that we need to preserve our strategic autonomy even as we come as close as possible to the US and we get the maximum we want out of the US to strengthen ourselves.
Okay.
That is the name of the game as far as India is concerned.
That's spoken like a good Foreign Service officer who spent his career being a fine career diplomat versus someone who's an academic and therefore may have a few concerns every now and then. Okay. Those are the images that dominate us. I want to thank all my guests joining me from Washington, New Delhi to give us a sense of what the last hour of this of our coverage has meant. We've tried to explain why this is an important moment in India's relationship with the United States. Remember, it doesn't end here because there'll be also the Quad meeting first face-to-face of the four countries in a couple of hours from now. And to take you through that and plenty more is my colleague Gaurav Sawant. Over to you, Gaurav.
Co-powered by DP World, world's leading logistics company.